All right. So I got a text from someone and I had to answer it. But okay. So I read the first few sentences of chapter one, and the questions that come out of that are, um, what on earth is Derrida talking about? Right. What does he mean by the devaluation of language, but also the inflation of language? What sort of research is he talking about? Um, it's very possible that these first few sentences may have been very clear to his readers at the time of the publication, but for us, we have to flip to page 9 to see precisely what he's talking about. Okay, so if at the top of page 9, so skip the rest of page 4, skip 6, 7, 8, look to the top of page 9 because it's here that he's going to try to specify right what on earth he's actually talking about. Okay. He says near the top of page 9, there's a sentence that begins, "For some time now." You see that? As a matter of fact, here and there, by a gesture and for motives that are profoundly necessary, whose degradation is easier to denounce than it is to disclose their origin. Forget all that. One says language for action, movement, thought, reflection, consciousness, unconsciousness, experience, affectivity, etc. So, um, so what Derrida is pointing out in that in a uh, wide array of fields are pursuing some sort of investigations into language, right? But what he's saying is that problems appear when we want to pursue language, to understand language, to understand what it is, right? And that one of the problems is, where do we locate it, right? Where do we locate language in order to study it, right? Is it simply in speech, or where is it? And so all the things he mentions here, right? Action, language as an action, right? Language as movement, right? As gestures, body gestures, as language. Language as thought. Is language simply thought put into words, right? Is it reflection? Does language reflect ideas, right? Is language consciousness, right? Do we think in words? Is it part of our unconscious? There's a very famous French philosopher or psychoanalyst named Jacques Lacan, right, who argued famously that the unconscious is structured like a language, right? And he meant it literally, not figuratively, okay? And uh, uh, so where do we locate language, right? Is there a language of emotions? Is there a language of mythology? Is there a language of experience, right? What is language, right? What is language? An action, an experience, emotion, thought, unconsciousness. What is it? Okay, so you see here, what Derrida is saying is that um, what we mean by language sort of inflates to encompass all of these things. And yet by becoming inflated to encompass all of these things, it becomes far, far less specific. It's hard to know even what language is if it's something that can cover all of these domains. Okay. I want to keep reading this paragraph, though, because it might help us understand what he means what he meant at the end of the Exergue section when he was saying that, right, that the way in which the term writing is being treated in contemporary life, that it seems to indicate that there should be, some attempt to rethink what we mean by writing. Okay. So he's just said this thing about language, and he continues. He says, "Now we tend to say writing, right? Writing, for all that it's been subordinated to language, right? Now we tend to say writing for all that and more. So all of those things we also call writing, okay? To designate not only the physical gestures of literal, pictographic, or ideographic inscription, but also the totality of what it makes possible, and also beyond the signifying face, the signified face itself. And thus we say writing for all that gives rise to an inscription in general, whether it is literal or not, and even if what it distributes in space is alien to the order of the voice." So, cinematography, he says, choreography, of course, but also pictorial, musical, sculptural. writing. Okay. So, what Derrida is pointing out here is that in the 19th and 20th centuries, you know, alongside the development of all these scientific ologies, you have the development of all these ographies, right? Just like the suffix ology comes from logic, right, or logos, spoken word reason. Graphy, ography, comes from gram, right? Grammatology, it comes from gram. So competing with all these ologies is all these ographies: cinematography, choreography, photography, pornography, right? Over and again, all these ideas of imagings, inscriptions, derivations from something original, that there's also an explosion of these things too, none of which need logos, none of which ground any sort of truth, right? All of which sort of affirm their derivation from something else, right? More than this, though, right, is the idea of the program, right? The program. There's grammatology again. There's the program, right? So in the development of the program, or programming, or coding, right, writing also begins to take on more than a metaphorical significance. Okay, Derrida continues. One might also speak of athletic writing, and with even greater certainty of military or political writing, in view of the techniques that govern those domains today. All this is to describe not only the system of notation secondarily connected with these activities, but the essence and the content of these activities themselves. It is also in this sense, and this is what I was saying, that the contemporary biologist speaks of writing and program in relation to the most elementary processes of information within the living cell. We might think of this now as DNA. We think of DNA as a code, as an inscribed written code, right? He goes on to say, and finally, whether it has essential limits or not, the entire field covered by the cybernetic program will be the field of writing. If the theory of cybernetics, right, we write computer programs. If the theory of cybernetics is by itself to oust all metaphysical concepts, including the concepts of soul, of life, of value, of choice, of memory, which until recently served to separate the machine from man, it must conserve the notion of writing, trace, gram, right? Gram, of course, is a written mark, or grapheme, until its own historico-metaphysical character is also exposed. Even before being determined as human, with all the distinctive characteristics that have always been attributed to man, and the entire system of significations that they imply, or non-human, the gram, or the grapheme, would thus name the element, right? In these fields, right, cybernetics, computer programming, biology, genetics, in these fields, writing, inscription, the program encompasses both the human and the non-human. It actually precedes the distinction between human and non-human. This suggests that, according to Derrida, that it is the gram, it is the graph, not the ology, but the gram and the graph, that grounds, right, what we are discovering to be the most basic things that we can study, right? Writing, in other words, not logos. In these fields, writing, the graph, the gram, not logos, not ology, seems to be taking on the shape of some sort of primary element, right? It is the gram, it is the graph that seems to be becoming, right, the ground or the origin of truth. So let's finish that paragraph really quickly. So the gram would name the element of this ground, an element whether it is understood as the medium or as the irreducible atom, of the archasynthesis in general, of what one must forbid oneself to define within the system of oppositions of metaphysics, of what consequently one should not even call experience in general, that is to say, the origin of meaning in general. Okay. So what Derrida is saying here, that the very thing that throughout the history of metaphysics has been barred from the origin of meaning, kept away from, right, experience itself, something that has always been secondary or derivative or a mere sort of reflection of something primary, of something or originary, right? That in these fields, suddenly that very thing names the element that secures, right, the truth of how things function, how memory functions, how machines function, how we function, how our genetics function, so on and so forth. Okay. However, this is not to say that Derrida is seeking to just flip things around and say that for 3,000 years writing has been secondary to speech and to reason and to truth, and now he's just going to simply flip them around and show that truth is actually derivative of some sort of originary writing, right? That's not quite right. Given that what we understand writing to be, right? Given that we wouldn't call these things writing without that whole history of how writing has been treated, right? Given that we understand writing, what we understand writing to be requires some understanding of it as a signifier, right? The signifier of the signifier, as not quite and not quite ever present. Right? We need to continue thinking of writing this way, the Derrida will argue. And that if we continue thinking of writing this way, linked up with the way in which it is beginning to resist the ethno and logocentrism of the entire history of metaphysics, philosophy, theology, and science, that there will be profound consequences for how we rethink things, and not just writing, not just speech, not just language, but how we rethink truth, how we rethink meaning, how we rethink presence, and so many other things. Okay. But so I'm not sure how much that helped, but for now I'm going to leave it there, and simply say that in this first chapter, what I've said will maybe help you get through those opening pages, and then I think, although the rest of the chapter is still sort of hard going, that Derrida will eventually start looking at specific examples of philosophers who have said things about speech and writing and truth and meaning, and then we'll actually have some things to talk about, right? Talk about there, all right, and some things to get some foothold on, and some actual examples. So maybe those pages will be a bit easier. But I'm going to leave it there for now, and we'll talk in class a bit more about some really important terms, right? Like sign, signifier, signified. We're going to talk about these things in class. You can actually Google them and you could probably find pretty easily some quick explanations of what they mean. But we might also talk a bit about some of the primary characters of Derrida's book, especially in this chapter. So for instance, Aristotle, Nietzsche, Hegel, and Heidegger. Who on earth are these people? Okay. As always, if you have any concerns, call me on my office phone during my office or advising hours, and of course email me at any time, and I'll try to get back to you quickly, okay? In the future, I'm going to try to make these videos a bit shorter and hopefully script them a bit better so that they're more clear. But I hope at the very least that my comments give you some sort of entry point, or some sort of foothold in dealing with what is admittedly a very difficult and at times frustrating book. Okay, and I ask that you. This is a big request. Ask that you trust me as your teacher, that slogging your way and working your way through this book is going to be worth it. Right? It's going at some point to feel like it's less, right, an impediment to your understanding, and that it's actually some rich food for thought. Okay, even if you don't understand it all. All right. Well, I'm going to sign off here, and I'll see you Wednesday.